Hey listeners, my name is Kayla, and this is Dark Tales from the Road. Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in today. Happy Wednesday. Hope you guys are having an amazing week here on Hump Day. I am excited about today. We're going to Iowa. I've been very much intrigued by this subject for a very long time because I think it is literally the craziest thing I've ever seen. And a lot of what came from that was from watching Ghost Adventures when this came up, and I heard it on another podcast where I'm like, this is crazy. Like, I still feel like I cannot grasp the concept of the Squirrel Cage Jail in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And I used to live in Omaha. I literally was like right next to it, and I didn't know about it back then. Otherwise, I would have totally done a tour of it. So if you're new here, I always start with a little history of the state, a little history of the city, and then jump right into our subject. I love history, so it's just a kind of cool thing for me, and I like learning new things, so I hope you guys are also learning new things. So I'm going to go ahead and just get started. So we're heading to Iowa. I love Iowa. Again, I lived in Omaha. It was literally just right on the border. You just kind of head east a little bit and you're in Iowa. But I have a friend who lives further east in Iowa, so I love it out there. I just love Iowa. I'm all for Iowa. So here is a little bit of history about Iowa. So the first inhabitants of what is now Iowa were the Paleo Indians. So they were the ancestors of the modern Native Americans. And the state of Iowa was actually named after a people of Native Americans that were actually named the Iowa Native American people. So, sorry, I made that super confusing, but they inhabited that area, and that's how Iowa eventually got its name. Crazily enough, the area around Des Moines was covered by glaciers about 14,000 years ago. It's kind of crazy to think about, how in the Ice Age and how it's evolved through the years into what it is now, The earliest evidence of settlement in the area was about 8,500 years ago. Insane. And a lot of them were just hunters and gatherers. They were also faced with massive droughts. So that was a huge impact on that region, and it still, happens today. So it was a harsh environment for the Native Americans that lived there. But eventually agriculture really started to set in, especially in western Montana, about 800 CE. And because of the droughts and trouble farming, villages would just disappear out of thin air because it just wasn't sustainable for them. Iowa people were essentially gone before the European American settlements that came in. So, and it could be they moved on to another area or they were wiped out due to it, And sadly, same things are happening as in a lot of other places. The tribes ended up seceding their land through treaties and purchases. This was around the 1830s and 40s. The last purchase that was made was the Sioux land in northern Iowa. And actually, in 1857, Native Americans named Fox and Sauk, I think, they actually bought back some of the land to create a reservation, and that's near Tama in central Iowa, and it's actually the only reservation in the state of Iowa. So Europeans reached Iowa, and a lot of them were first French explorers like Louis Cholet and Jacques Marquette. And that was in like the 1600s. And then permanent settlement didn't actually take place until the 1830s. So the French came in the 1600s, but then the Europeans and Americans out east, they're all traveling and starting to settle into Iowa. Iowa was a part of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and then the Treaty of Iowa came about in 1838, and the population at the time was 23,000 people. It was admitted to the Union in 1846 as the 29th state, and there was like this huge controversy between the South and the North, slaveholding versus free, and Iowa was a huge part of that. But the compromise really came together at the end, which created their admission to the Union. And from like 1850s, the population just tripled. And there was a massacre that occurred in 1857, and it was called Spirit Lake Massacre, and it was like the final conflict between the Native Americans in the state. And that was 1857. So prior to the Civil War, Iowa was known as the frontier, and there was a lot like what you see in westerns. There was lawlessness, vigilantes, lynching, and it was really making the society very unsteady. It was not a very well settled society in the beginning of Iowa. And so then comes the Civil War, and Iowa is very involved on both sides of the issues. So it's very much split. And what's cool is that they were a huge role in the Underground Railroad. So they were helping the slaves escape from the South and get up into Canada. And they had more troops than any other state in the United States during Civil War. They had more proportion of people to its population is what it meant. So I was a big player. So then we go into the Jim Crow laws, and so Iowa did not have that. They did not pass it until the 1870s. But racial discrimination was a huge player in Iowa, and it was practiced until 1948, when finally a civil rights case comes in, and they won, and it was the 1884 Iowa Civil Rights Act. A huge contribution to Iowa and its economy was the expansion of the railroad after the Civil War, and removing all the Native Americans, and settlement just exploded, and immigrants are just flooding in from the eastern states and from Europe. And so by 1900, the claims of the land were just filling the state. It was like completely populated. But then it started to show kind of a decline because what was happening with the initial settlers. So their children didn't want to live there anymore. They moved out of state. So they really tried to kind of change things around. So barbed wire became a huge thing to help diversify agriculture, if that makes sense. And a lot of the wetlands there, they decided to drain them to help with more efficient agriculture production. And then corn became the basis of Iowa's agriculture. And it's still like that today. Corn is a huge commodity there. And at that time, a lot of that crop was feeding livestock. But now corn is huge there, and Iowa sweet corn is the best thing ever. So World War I comes in, and this created maximum demands for production. And so then prices got higher, and since that time, Iowa has always had agricultural surpluses, which means lower prices and higher land values. So during the panics, during the Depression, 19th to 20th century, there were some ups and downs with their economy. So during the 20th century, politics really came into play and took the national scene because of farm crises. And their major issue, there was an Iowan, his name is Henry A. Wallace. He was Secretary of Agriculture during the terms of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And so he's there helping Iowa, helping these farmers, and he actually became Roosevelt's vice president in his third term. So agriculture just continues to thrive in Iowa, and it still does today. And so greater productivity meant lower prices, which created even more competition between farmers. But by the 21st century, the service industry had become a huge dominant in their economy. And Iowans, even today, they are fiercely proud of their heritage, especially their agricultural heritage. While that is still a huge factor, like we said, service industries were starting to come in and they were embracing a more diversified economy and including, biotechnology, research, and development. And also they started becoming ethnically diverse also when increasing numbers of Hispanic people came to Iowa. And then kind of lastly, before some interesting facts. So Iowa is a very huge part of politics. So it's always kind of been a Republican Party state, but through the years, the Democrats actually surpassed the Republicans in voter registration, and that really brought down the dominance of the Republican Party in the state. So some interesting facts. So there is this culture in Iowa about the effigy mound builders, and this was in northeastern Iowa around 1400 to 750 BC. There are more than 200 mounds of just earth and dirt that actually still remain in the Effigy Mounds National Monument, and they're actually shaped like bears and birds and bison, and they believe it was for ceremonies or different celestial events that they would practice. A man named Sergeant Charles Floyd was the only member of the Corps of Discovery to die during the Lewis and Clark expedition when they were moving west. In 1804, he had an infection that caused a ruptured appendix, and they actually built a 100-foot obelisk in his final resting place in Sioux City. The Winnebago Indians, they were forced to leave their land in Wisconsin about 1840, so the U.S. government offered the tribe protection in Iowa, and so it was protection from other tribes and illegal settlers, and they built a fort, and so 1842 Fort Atkins was built, and it was the only fort built in the United States that was made to protect one Indian tribe from another, which feels so contradicting with how everything that went down and wiping out the population and sending them elsewhere. That it seems so contradictory. Since 1972, again, politically, Iowa is a huge part of it because they kick off the presidential primaries and they host the first national caucus, which was a huge part of the Jimmy Carter area. Jimmy Carter was very unknown, and then after the Iowa caucus, he became the front runner in the 1976 Democratic caucus. And this received national attention and helped him win the presidency. And so that really came into light how important Iowa caucuses are for presidential elections. And lastly here, Iowa is the largest producer of corn. In 2011, farmers harvested more than 2.3 billion bushels. Very cool. We're going to move on to Council Bluffs. Again, if you are in Omaha, Council Bluffs is literally like right there. You can go in and out of Iowa all the time right there. So in 1824, a man, St. Louis businessman named Francois Guittard? Sure, just go with it. He established the first white settlement on that boundary of Iowa, and he named it Traders Point. So he was a fur trader, and he did a lot of other mercantile type things, and he worked a lot with the Native American tribes in the area. So another man comes in. His name is Billy Caldwell. He was the son of a Potawatomi. Potawatomi. It's a big deal there, and I know I've said it a million times, so I really hope I got it right that time. So his mother was Native American, and his dad was a Scot-Irish immigrant. So he came into that area, and he came in, and he was actually very well known for negotiating treaties with the U.S. on behalf of these Native American tribes. And so eventually he decided to settle near that city that was created of Traders Point. And another man came in. He was a Jesuit missionary priest named Father Pierre Jean de Smet. And he was there about 1838, and he set up the first church and school in that Trader Points area. So Trader Points was a very desirable place to live. And you had to cross the Missouri River, and that was, a tough way for pioneers to push their way into the western states and onto Oregon and California, the Mormon settling in Utah, and the Lewis and Clark trails. So again, Iowa became a state in 1846, the 29th, and that area known as Traders Point is growing like crazy. They actually renamed it to Canesville after a man named Thomas L. Kane. He helped to negotiate federal permission for the Mormons to use Indian land along the Missouri River for their winter camp about 1846-47. And even the Mormon leader Brigham Young, he arrived there. He was, known as the second prophet, and he was president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Canesville. Mormons were a huge part of that. There were 200 Mormon pioneers that went there, and they were able to build, they call it a tabernacle. I don't know. But it was called Canesville Tabernacle, and they built it in 2.5 weeks. So I don't know how big this was or what, but that seems insane. But having 200 people working like that, I guess you could get it done. And he actually helped open the first post office in Canesville. So by 1852, Mormons were ready to go. They wanted to settle west in Utah. And then that's when the town was renamed Council Bluffs, because there was a site that was 20 miles to its north where Lewis and Clark's expedition met and had a council with the Ote tribe on bluffs near the Missouri River. That's how it became Council Bluffs. 1853, a man named Greenville M. Dodge, he took charge of the surveying crew in central Iowa to find a terminal for the Rock Island Railroad right on the Mississippi River. So he chose Council Bluffs, and in 1855, him and his family moved there. And again, he came in and he created a banking house, and that was the Pacific National Bank. 1858, Dodge met a man, an Illinois Railroad lawyer, and his name was Abraham Lincoln. And he also met a railroad financier named Thomas Durant, and they were hired to work in Iowa with Dodge to help with the surveying. So there's a show, it's called Hell on Wheels. It is over, but there are 5 seasons of it, and it really takes you on the events of building the first railroad across the country west. And it's really good. You hear about Thomas Durant. It really brings the history alive. It's really cool. I like things about that era, so I definitely recommend it. It was a very, very good show. We were addicted to it. So, it looks like it's on YouTube, and let's see, YouTube, Sling, Amazon Prime, and then you can pay for it with Google, Apple, or Vudu, if you guys are interested. So yeah, that's when I first heard that. I was like, I have to mention that. So when they met Lincoln, Lincoln and Dodge had very similar interests in what they wanted to do with this transcontinental railroad, and they wanted to move it from the Midwest to the Pacific Ocean. They met again in 1859, where Lincoln came to Council Bluffs to deliver his campaign speech. Very cool, right? So 1861 was when Lincoln was elected president, but Congress didn't support him. It was very, very divided between the free northern states and the southern slave states. So there were actually 2 attempts to establish a transcontinental railroad in the middle of the country, but they kept failing because of the disagreements, the opposition from the southern states who wanted a different route through like the southern part of the state, and then probably also from the north down into the south. So southern states eventually secede from the Union, and Congress is back together and quickly approves the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, which Lincoln signed into law that same year. So then plan is set, and they're going to build a 1,900-mile continuous railroad line across the western United States, connecting San Francisco to Omaha, Nebraska. This was about 1860s when this happened, late 1860s. So if you don't know, one side is traveling west. Well, where in San Francisco, they actually started building eastwards so they could connect. And that was the Central Pacific Railroad. And it started immediately building their rail line so, again, they could connect. The capital investment for it was $100,000. But in today's money, it's $2.6 billion that was needed. That's a lot of money. So the Union Pacific, going west, they actually didn't start construction until 1865 because they were really struggling to find the financial backing and workers and materials, because this is still all happening during the Civil War. And Brigham Young actually supplied a lot of the crews that were building the railroad when they were in Utah building through. So Thomas Durant, he started out in the Army, and when he retired, he hired Dodge to become the Union Pacific's chief construction engineer. And so when it was all done, the Union Pacific, they headed west from Omaha, but they couldn't connect. They didn't connect into the eastern United States. It ended at Council Bluffs. So then they decided to build this massive bridge for the Transcontinental Railroad to the eastern United States, and that happened in 1873. It is still there today. It has been reconstructed and rebuilt twice, but it opened in 1916, and this makes Council Bluffs a huge transportation hub. And there's a lot of industry in that area, like cast iron pipe. Processed foods are a huge part of that area, and Omaha also. And then gambling is a huge part of their economy also. All right, let's go to Squirrel Cage Jail. I love the name of it. The concept blows my mind, and I just cannot imagine if I had to be locked up in this jail. Okay, so it is located in Council Bluffs, Iowa. It is also named the Potawatomi Jailhouse, but it is nicknamed and known as the Squirrel Cage Jail because it is one of only 3 remaining, quote, rotary jails. So we'll hear about that more, but it's a concept of keeping criminals put in one spot with less jailers having to look after them, and they were in rotating cells. So it was built in 1885, and it wanted to really minimize the interaction of the jailer and the convicts, and then it made the cells twirl. And so I'll post a ton of pictures about this because it's really crazy how they did this. Yeah, I'll keep going, and then I'll post a ton of pictures. So the design was that the cells were located on a central carousel, So it literally, the middle stays still and it spins around, and it was hand cranked. And so if you think about, if they're all full, how hard would it be to hand crank that? And there was only, you could do one inmate at a time. And so there was only one opening, and you would hand crank and spin until the inmate was able to get out and be in the holding area. And so one single entryway into the jail cells. And it's a, snowball effect of what happened. So rotary jails did exist elsewhere, but they only had one level of cells. So they're just cranking and it's moving in a circle so that one criminal can get out at a time. But Council Bluffs didn't want to do that. They created a 3 stacked level of holding cells. And that's how they got their name, because it was such a tall structure. It made it look like a cage, one that might hold a small animal, hence a squirrel. So by the 1960s, it was not doing so well. So again, it was built in 1885. By the 1960s, it frequently became stuck. And the jail was active until 1969, when it finally closed its doors, and it was taken over by the Historical Society of Pottawatomie County, and now is a museum that you can also do ghost tours at. So you guys can come and do and you guys can come and do tours and ghost hunting tours, and you can really experience it, but it does not turn anymore. But it's just, from all these stories, it's like it is a wonder to look at. It was considered modern incarceration, which is crazy. So, like we had talked about before, Council Bluffs was lawless. So much going on in the 1880s that taxpayers of Pottawatomie County, they refused to pay for an expensive jail. They refused. So this rotary offered a very cheap solution. And so then it only had to be staffed by one guard with a gun. Easy. Less money, all that. Oh, I forgot about this. So also it's known as Squirrel Cage Jail because there was a high city population of black squirrels. So yeah. So again, a metal drum stacked with 3 floors, and they were like pie slice shaped cells. So they were not a rectangle They were They were pie shaped, so it's like even more uncomfortable. And then they had steel lined walls. Again, only one door, and the jailer had to crank to spin the wheels to let prisoners in and out. And architecturally speaking, can you imagine? Like, I will post a lot of pictures, but I just got chills because it's like, it seems so very creepy and morbid. Yeah. So here's a quote by a man named Ryan Ronsfeld. He said, quote, "It was a 19th century marvel, a brilliant idea." So he was a past president of the Historical Society that owns the jail. And he said, quote, "You didn't have to pay many people to watch a lot of prisoners." So the idea was great, but it also was a huge downfall. So the gears kept jamming. And after so many jams, it really was told it was a failure. Newspapers were reporting this was a failure. And it was actually, they were calling that only 2 years after it actually opened. And, these rotary jails, only 18 of them were actually built during its heyday. And Squirrel Cage was the biggest of them all, hence their massive problems. So the drum weighed 45 tons empty. Like, include all these men and women and, massive men and stuff like that. And then it was balanced on a 3-foot square base that actually kept shifting in the soil because the soil was so unstable. And so this was a group that was being taken around by Ryan, who I quoted earlier, and he took the group to the top of the cage where it's suspended from a single iron beam to show them the emergency hatch. So Ryan says, quote, "I've never known anybody crazy enough to climb that," he said. And there was actually a prisoner. He was so desperate that he did climb up it. And he discovered it didn't lead to the outside. So he had to wake the jailer somehow to let him back into his cell. So a huge part of why Squirrel Cage Jail is so bad, aside from all the rotating drums and a huge risk was starvation. So if it was jammed for too long, the inmates would starve. They wouldn't get their food. And it's not like they had anything else where they could walk up like the jailers and feed everybody. No, it was one at a time. You have to crank and crank, give them their food, crank and crank. And they brought in so many different inmates. So they didn't segregate them between who did what. They were all housed together in these cells. So there were prostitutes, but then there were chicken thieves, and they were housed with rapists and killers. It was just not, an example is a man named Gilbert Ranfelt. He was put in jail for writing a $1.50 check that bounced. And then we'll talk about him later, but a man named Jake Bird, he was the opposite. He was an axe murderer that killed as many as 50 people, and those two would be housed together. Just crazy. Another man, his name is Charles Noel Brown. He was incarcerated at Squirrel Cage Jail because he went on a, quote, 3-day drunken murder spree, and he became the last man to be hung in Iowa. Hanged. I never know which one's right, but he was hanged in Iowa, and they actually kept his noose. And he was hanged in 1962, and it is displayed in the Squirrel Cage Jail showcase. So a lot hanging on to that thing. That's crazy. Another problem that they ran into were broken arms and legs, because the prisoners would mistakenly or deliberately, some did, they would stick their arms and legs out through the cell bars as the cage spun. So Ryan says, quote, "Some people would go crazy in here and do anything to get out." There was a prisoner, his name was Willie Brown. He actually killed himself trying to get a medical transfer by eating glass. And who knows the situation? If, he wanted a medical transfer and he was, doing this for attention, but they couldn't crank it fast enough or something, So the Squirrel Cage Jail was constantly at the attention of the taxpayers of the area, and it was going terrible. It, needed to be condemned. It was just, but the taxpayers, they refused to pay anymore. They will pay for one jailer, they won't pay for another. So then continually spiraling to get worse and worse and worse. Ryan said, quote, "It was cheaper just to keep it going." That's crazy. It literally was cheaper to just keep the jail going. And it did. It survived until 1960 when the fire marshal came in and he personally disabled the drum because it took 2 days to reach a corpse of a prisoner who died in his cell. And so they would just, because of that, the inmates were turned loose and just wandered around the jail. Ryan also said, quote, "In its last years, it was a free-for-all." So again, no one's in the jail cells. They're literally just out. And you can see different holes that were patched in the wall where they were trying to tunnel to freedom because there was literally one guard. What could he do? And so he sat in his office and watched TV, what could he do? So after the fire marshal came in, they named it, quote, "unfit for human habitation," and all the inmates were removed and sent to other prisons. And so the Historical Society comes in and they protested. They stood in front of the bulldozer to make sure that it was not demolished. And so the citizens of Pottawatomie County, granted the history of the jail with them, they still had this attachment to it. And they wanted it preserved to be recognized as this wonder of this, incarceration technology. You know what I'm trying to say. And they wanted to make sure that it was worth saving. So it is open today. You can take tours, paranormal investigations. You can do an overnight lock-in, and a lot of those are for fundraisers. And Ryan explains to the group that this place is grungy. It is horrible, and it looks like the day that it was closed. So they didn't clean. They didn't sanitize anything. And they were like, yeah, a lot of these prisons that are open for tours now, theirs is sterile. They cleaned it all up. But this is what Ryan says, quote, sorry, theirs is very sterile. Ours is much more interesting, he said. So literally, it is not clean to go in there. And probably if you do the overnight, they probably take care of that. But that you really experience this grime and what it was like being there. And they even say there's this like stink of terror and horror and fear that is in the air in the Squirrel Cage Jail. Ryan says, quote, it's the kind of place where you still got to watch your step. Quote, we've had people in here and get creeped out so bad they turn around and walk right back out. It is considered one of the most haunted attractions in Council Bluffs. Also because, fun fact, it was built on the site of an old church morgue. So it could be a lot more than just the prisoners there. And popularity with the paranormal community has grown a lot in recent years after. And I think a lot has to do with, a lot of the TV shows going there, a lot of podcasts covering it and stuff like that. And they do flashlight tours and paranormal investigations, but a lot of the community also said that, and the residents of the jail said that they always felt something was wrong. Even in the 1900s, they felt something was wrong. It's really weird saying 1900s because I was born in the 1900s. My kid says 1900s also, and it just freaks me out. Anyway, so one story is that a jailer in the 1950s refused to live in the fourth floor apartment because he continually heard footsteps on the floor when no one was around. He actually opted to just sleep in the jail's second floor rather than deal with those noises. Museum staff and volunteers said that they have similar happenings all throughout the jail. One of them, her name's Kat Slaughter, she's the museum manager, says, quote, many of the jail staff and volunteers have heard footsteps, voices, whispers, and doors moving. Some have seen dark shadows move across the stairs or past doorways. So Kat Slaughter, she believed that the jail was haunted because of the known deaths there. So she mentioned 4. I think another one mentions 3 or 5 or something. But this is what she mentioned, that there was a prisoner that died of a heart attack. Another fell 3 stories trying to carve his name into the jail ceiling. Another hung himself. And an officer was shot when a gun misfired during a riot gun training. And the jail got a lot of national attention, not just from hearsay from the paranormal community, but because all of a sudden it's being featured on TV shows. It was featured on Travel Channel's Most Terrifying Places and Ghost Adventures Serial Killer Spirits. And I will go through the Ghost Adventures one at the end. She says, quote, paranormal investigators have found EVPs or audio recordings of voices and sounds of things that weren't there. Quote, they caught photos and videos of shadows as well. their equipment has picked up EMF hits in areas where there shouldn't be any electromagnetic interference. She goes on to say, quote, we've had different reports throughout the years of footsteps, dark shadow figures, doors slamming and opening, things moving around, voices when you're the only one in the building, and whistling. So she's had, 6 years of experience. She says, quote, basically all the things I mentioned, I've personally experienced. And so a lot of, paranormal investigations are continuing to happen, and they all say the same thing. Just very on point. Another man, his name's Rob Gray, him and his partner, Sarah Stream, they're a part of a team of investigators called Paranormania. I hope I said that correct. And he said, quote, every single time we're there, something will happen. And they said that they've been to this jail countless times. So they actually stayed there. So their first night that they stayed there, it was just silence. But then all of a sudden they start hearing boots approaching their cell that they were in. So they were sleeping in the cells, guys. Gray said, quote, and it walks right up to the front of our cell, standing there. And somebody is looking at you. He continues, she just quietly looks at me in the dark and is like, did you hear that? I'm like, you literally have to be deaf not to hear this craziness that just happened in front of us. Full chills, hair on end. So they're constantly in there also trying to debunk, especially the top floor. They said there's just a certain spot where all of their equipment will go crazy every single time. Quote, there's definitely something different going on the 4th floor in the apartment that seems to be separate from everything else, Stream said. Quote, one female got her hair pulled and she looked around at me thinking I was goofing with her, and I was like 5 feet away from her, Gray said. Gray continues and he says, quote, I tell people, you're literally standing in the only one in the entire planet. You're not going to find another one of this magnitude. Which is true. There are 2 that are still open, but they were just the single floor. This was a 3 floor. It's, And it's said that a lot of inmates who stayed there will actually come and participate in the tours, and they want to tell their story. And they will host public investigations, especially leading up to Halloween, during the time of Halloween, all that fun stuff. So I want to talk about a famous inmate, and there's others, but he was really prominent. So his name was Jake Bird. He was a convicted serial axe murderer, and he was the most famous inmate of Squirrel Cage. So a lot of the tours really cover him because he was a railroad worker, and he is suspected of killing over 40 people in the Midwest and Western states before he was sentenced to death. And Ghost Adventures really puts their whole show on their focus on Jake Bird. There's also talks of a hex, the Jake Bird hex, and they allowed Jake Bird to speak at his hearing when he was in court, and he said this, quote, I'm putting the Jake Bird hex on all of you who had anything to do with my being punished. Mark my words, you will die before I do. And there are records that say that 6 people who were tied to the case died within a year of his statement. Coincidence? I don't know. So on the tours, you will see the entire prison. So you'll see, the processing room, the dining area, kitchen, all the cells, the warden's apartment at the top of the building, and it says to set aside at least an hour for your tour. Again, a lot of discussions about Jake Bird, but there are also a lot of other scary things that happen. So an example is kids and adults, they might feel uncomfortable seeing that noose in the display case that killed the inmate. And they say the most common spirit that they encounter is the jail's former warden, Bill Foster. They think that he still watches over the facility to today. A lot of it does not happen during the daytime, but it is said that Jake Bird may upset younger kids. So it's definitely more suited for middle school, high school age kids to better kind of handle everything. And, they do overnight paranormal investigations. So they do them kind of randomly throughout the year. And you can choose from a 4, 8, or a 12-hour investigation. Pretty cool. I can't believe I didn't know about this when I lived in Omaha, and I'm like devastated. I want to go see it so bad. So lastly here, I watched the Ghost Adventures episode for you. If you haven't seen it, it's actually really good. Very creepy, very intelligent. That's what makes these so creepy. So again, it was called Serial Killer Spirits. It's not on their main seasons. So Jake Bird is their main focus in all of this. But he was known as the Tacoma Axe Killer. That was his name. And he was also known for cursing people, like we talked about the Jake Bird Hex. And people believed he had supernatural powers. So they're literally walking into the jail and they're hit immediately with a massive energy right at the threshold. And, they're carrying around EMFs. This happens while they're doing tours and stuff. So they have their equipment ready and the EMF is going insane. They show Zach the noose that's on display. And while they're doing an interview, something behind Jay, it was like metallic sounds, like pots and pans hitting together. And he starts saying, I have a very, very weird energy and I'm really cold. And Zach, he feels the same thing. Cold spots just all around them. So they met with a man named Byron Gable. He was their tour guide and he had a story. So a friend of his went to the attic apartment and sat in the rocking chair and he was trying to communicate with whomever, and books started flying off the shelf. And he felt this overwhelming fear that he should not be in there and that there was a presence around him. So even now, he will wake up to slamming noises at his own home. So either something went with him or he was very traumatized from it, because he says it was a life-changing event and he believes in ghosts 100%. So a lot of the security guards, they will, and the jailer at the time, they could feel the staircase shaking. They saw it shaking. They felt it shaking. And it just, again, just this trauma and fear that went into it. So Aaron and Billy, they're in the jailer's apartment. So this was before they started the lockdown, but they kind of went up there to do it, and they get instant EVP that says search the house. And so they start questioning, do you know Jake Bird? And another one that says, quote, why should we worry? So they ask, is he here? And they another answer, he's hiding. And even watching it, everything's very clear, very intelligent. They're doing full sentences. And all of a sudden they get another one. It says need or leave. They couldn't quite tell. So need, leave the weapons. And then another one said, quote, kill them with something. What? That's so freaking creepy. And then, they ask, where can we find Jake Bird? What was this room for? And they just get this creepy, evil laugh. Just the worst. Like, I'm getting chills just remembering it on the show. Just, so we go on lockdown. Zach questions. Jake Bird was known for his curses, and people died, supposedly, from these curses. But did he curse the building himself? The building that took his life? So they're in Jake Bird's cell. They're doing a spirit box reading. And while they're sitting in his cell, there's a boom, boom, boom. They're asking questions in Jake Bird's cell. That boom came from a completely different cell. It was very, very creepy. So then the spirit box says, where are you? And it was a female voice. So females were housed there, just not as many, So they started asking more questions. Who's here with us right now? And they get, quote, come attack me. It was a male voice, and a light anomaly from Jake's cell also came at the same time. So, they ask Jake Bird, first and last name, and they get, quote, you got it. In a weird accent, a male voice, the same male voice as before. And then they get, quote, get back, same voice. So everyone is really starting to have a very hard time breathing. They're being affected immensely by the energy around them, and they're uneasy. They need to get out of there. And when they look at the coverage of the camera, Zach is talking about the energy, the breathing, and uneasy, and a light anomaly flies into him. I'm all about the light anomalies, the orbs. I feel like I can really tell the difference between bugs, dust, all that. And so I'm a true believer in those ones, and I really believe they can massively affect you. So they're going to the attic apartment, which was where the old jailer refused to stay. And Zach is in there, and he sees a black flash of darkness twice. And Aaron is recording him, and Aaron says he felt a massive energy come at him. Like he heard the floorboards moving, run up, and just stop at him. And at that same time, there was another light anomaly on that camera. So everything is corresponding. It's pretty crazy. So on the second level, in between the bars, is just Zach. And he is near Jake's cell. And then all of a sudden, these lights come out of nowhere. This part really got me, because I'm like, whoa, what are those lights? And it looks like literally someone in his cell with a flashlight looking around. Like it is a bright light. And it is so freaking creepy, and everyone's freaking out. Who had a flashlight? Were you there? Was anyone near this? Who has their flashlights on? And nothing. Could not debunk it. Went in the cell, no light. It is just insane. So Zach runs down to get another camera and he wants to head back to the apartment. But as he's walking, he sees a black mass under the stairs. So there's so much going on in this jail right now. Billy meets with Zach. They're actually going to the Jake's cell again. They put a geophone on the ground, like right at the entrance of the cell. And I didn't notice at first, but then Zach is freaking out because it moved. And they're like, what? And he said, no, I set it down straight, in a straight line, and now it's cocked to the side. They're like, okay. And so Zach asked, are you moving our device? And he gets back, quote, mostly. So he straightened it, and it moves again. It's so creepy, guys. So creepy. So I know I'm bouncing around. Zach's in the apartment, and he asks anyone here to communicate. He gets like 3 answers. So the first one he gets, quote, choose. So Zach says, who? And then it says, Faye and Jackie. Where did that come from? It's crazy. Aaron and Billy go into the basement. This one shook me. I keep getting chills. So they're in the basement. They're hearing knocking sounds, and they're getting louder and louder. Billy all of a sudden freaks out. He's tapped on the shoulder. They ask the question, any cellmates? And a male voice comes through that says, quote, out of the basement. They ask, who are you? And then they get back, quote, is there a name? And it sounds like a question. It's and then forcefully, Aaron is kind of not yelling, but he's like, come through this device. And they get an EVP that says, quote, Jake Bird fight. And they'll say, they asked, where's Bird? Again, quote, is this a demand? Oh my God. And then they say, I want to see Jack Bird. And they get a laugh. Another creepy laugh and a light anomaly the same time as the laugh. Ah! So Jake Bird sounds so scary. While Zach's in the apartment again, the uneasy feeling, just a horrible feeling. He actually gets an EVP of screams, multiple screams, creepy ass screams. Just, and then lastly, Zach and Arian had experienced a lot of pain during the whole thing too. They both were complaining about it, and then in the end they were like, yeah, I felt like we kept getting kicked in the nuts. I'm like, oh, the ghosts just don't like you, Zachy baby. But yeah, that's kind of the end of that episode, and I highly recommend it. I watch all mine on Discovery Plus, so highly recommend that episode. So yeah, that is the end of Squirrel Cage Jail in Council Bluffs, Iowa. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Join us next week. We're going to be going to Oklahoma. And then after that, I'm exploring the zodiac sign of Pisces. I'm so pumped. And I know, I hope you guys liked the last one. I did get some really good feedback. So thank you guys all for your support and for listening. If you want to follow me, I have an Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and a YouTube. I also have a Patreon if you'd like to support the show. And I think that's it. We will see you guys next week in Oklahoma. Have an amazing rest of your week. Bye.
Tired of the same old podcasts every week? When you're ready for something different, come give us a shot.
Greetings. We're Technically a Conversation, a podcast for curious people by curious people.
Every week, we take turns sharing a new topic, and the other host has no idea what the topic will be.
Our topics are all over the place, from light and funny to dark and sometimes spooky.
We've covered everything from true crime, historical events and people, pop culture icons, the supernatural and occult.
I like that.
And legends and folklore.
My favorite. We're like the Dollar Tree stuff you should know.
Except completely different. No matter what the topic is, we try to make the episodes funny.
Yeah, you may not want to advertise that. Our jokes aren't very good.
What are you talking about? My jokes are fantastic.
Hey, I get paid to laugh either way.
Wait, you get paid?
Check us out at technicallyaconversation.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Shout out to the 11.5 people that listen to us on Google Podcasts. Wait, you said you were getting paid?